Hello and welcome to Stoicism, Philosophy as a Way of Life. My name is Donald Robertson and today's guest is Robin Waterfield. Robin's a British classicist who's translated many works of Plato, Xenophon and other Greek writers. He's also the author of several books, including the recently published Plato of Athens, the first full-length modern biography of Plato in English. Hello, Robin. How are you?
I'm fine, Donald. Thank you very much for inviting me onto the show.
Well, it's a pleasure. I'm looking forward to it. I want you to tell us everything you know about Plato in a moment. But before we do that, I should say I'm speaking from Montreal, and you are currently
Southern Greece.
in southern Greece.
Not just currently, that's always where I am. I don't have any other property dotted around the globe like some people.
You're you're right there,
Right
like
there, overlooking the sea. Could be
uh,
worse.
yeah. I wish I was there right now. Like we were talking about that earlier. Um, so I wanted to dive right in and ask
Yep.
about Plato, and I noticed you said in your book, which I read cover to cover recently and thoroughly enjoyed actually.
Thank you.
So I hope more people read it after this podcast of ours. You said Plato is not just important, but super important. Uh, why, first of all, should anybody today care about Plato? What's so important about him?
Um, Actually, well, I think there's no single answer to that question. I think he's important in a large number of ways. I mean, I think people should care about him, for instance, because if they care about fine literature, about fine writing, because he's a terrific writer, he's fun just to read.
Yeah.
And that's one thing. Or then there are more specialist things. A metaphysician might, practicing academic philosopher metaphysician might say that he's super important because of his work in metaphysics, and an ethicist might say because of his work in ethics, and so on and so forth. But leaving aside any specific ideas or theories that he came up with, I think he's most important because of the way he conceived doing philosophy. Um, he thought, Aristotle agreed too, that doing philosophy is the best way of life for a human being. Um, um, and since all human beings are endowed with curiosity, somewhere in the Theaetetus, Plato says philosophy begins with curiosity. Philosophy begins with wonder.
Mm-hmm.
Since all human beings are endowed with curiosity or wonder, we all have the potential to be philosophers. Not that everyone makes use of that potential, however. So, so philosophy in this sense becomes a kind of a blanket term for ways in which to feed that curiosity, which Plato saw as an innately human quality, one of the things that makes us specifically human. But each time you feed that curiosity, its horizons expand, and it finds there's more to seek. And so Plato saw philosophy as an open-ended pursuit, one that could well occupy a lifetime, and one that corresponded to our nature as human beings, or at least, as I was saying, to the best part of our nature. Plato saw us as kind of caught between a bestial side to our nature and a divine side of our nature. Philosophy feeds the divine part of us, and thus weakening the hold of the bestial part, and brings us closer to what one way in which Plato described the ultimate goal of life was assimilation to God. So philosophy feeds the divine part of us, makes us, in fact, more divine in ourselves, brings us closer to God.
Well, we could all do with more of that, as you're implying. But I think it's fair to say, to a large extent, today studying Plato is the province of academics, and there are people outside academia that read Plato's dialogues, but perhaps not as widely read as things like Marcus Aurelius, for example.
Yeah.
Stoicism's gone through this resurgence, but we haven't really seen the same kind of resurgence of interest in Plato per se. And I wonder, do you feel that more people outside of academia should be learning about Plato?
Oh, I absolutely do. As I've already kind of implied, he is really good to read. I can't think of any other philosopher who presents his ideas in such a palatable form. That I'm sure everybody listening knows, but his works are called dialogues because they are, in effect, um, portraits of interactions between people who are raising philosophical questions, but they're superbly written. I mean, okay, I mean, there's a sense in which certainly Plato has a tendency to take us deeper more quickly than, say, Marcus does. And so he's
Mm-hmm.
always going to be a slightly more difficult read than Plato. But nevertheless, what I'm
Mm,
saying is that he's such a good writer. Sorry, than
yeah,
Marcus. But what I'm saying is he's such a good writer that he is very accessible. I mean, The Republic,
yeah.
along, on everybody's list of one of the great books of the world, is really, really readable, provided you can find a good translation, I hasten to add. And of course, it's been my mission for
Mm-hmm.
40 years, almost exactly 40 years. I had my first translation of Plato published in 1982. So it's been my mission to present Plato
Mm-hmm.
to a wider audience.
Right.
I've got, I don't know, 15 or so, no, I think 12 or so volumes of Plato's works. I've translated over half of his corpus. So yeah, no, I really think more people should be reading Plato. I think he's one of those writers, you get as much out of it as you can. Whatever your background, there'll be something there for you. And next time you go back, you'll find something else. Because one of the reasons I say that I consider him a really great writer is that in the best of his works, there's always there always seems to be something more going on under the surface of the text than
Yeah.
you're quite aware of. And so I think that each time we go back to, the really great works, Symposium, Republic, Phaedo, Gorgias, and a bunch of others, the shorter works, the early works, every time we go back, we're going to get something more out of it.
It reminds me a bit of reading Shakespeare or something, or other great literature in general. But I was going to say also, I think for some people, maybe, I'm going to, maybe this is a bit of a glib thing to say, but it's often said that today people's attention spans seem a bit shorter, perhaps, than they were because we're used to social media and things like that. And so I feel like maybe some people don't have the attention span to get from beginning to end through the Republic, for example. I'm wondering what the obstacles like
Yeah.
to Plato reaching a wider audience today. Sometimes I suggest to people just read book one of the
Yep.
Republic, because it's the easiest bit
Yep.
to
I
read.
mean, we'll
I
certainly
think.
take it in chunks anyway.
Yeah,
I mean, you can't sit down and read the whole thing. You read a chapter at bedtime, as
yeah.
one does.
And the Apology is also a really good
Oh, the
gateway
Apology is
into Plato.
wonderful.
It's a
It's funny.
masterpiece.
It's a
Yeah.
masterpiece. It's witty and sarcastic and ironic and funny. I love it. I
And
love
then
it.
and then they could progress onto the Symposium, which is also maybe one of the more kind of dramatic or
Really,
colourful
that's
dialogues.
very accessible work, the Symposium. And,
Yeah.
I mean, Plato's most famous for his metaphysical theory, which we call the theory of forms. It's not a very happy translation of form, but anyway, it's the one
Hmm.
we're stuck with. And the Symposium consists of a series of speeches given at a party, at a symposium, um, culminating with one delivered by Socrates, Plato's teacher historically, and also his sort of hero and his main mouthpiece in the dialogues. So culminating in his speech by Socrates, in which he introduces the theory of forms in the most accessible fashion imaginable. So I mean, yeah, symposium is a really good place to start. Apologies,
We're talk
Symposium.
we're talking about masterpieces. I always think it's strange to be, trying to encourage people to read them in the sense we're kind of like, like doing a sales job and pitching these books to a wider audience. And you guys should read Plato's Apology. Of course they should, though.
Yeah,
Because it almost goes without saying that everybody should, if they can,
yeah,
try to read these things. But when I was a young guy, I remember trying to read the Republic, and I was probably a teenager. I think I was about 17, and I kind of got about halfway through it, and then I found it hard going. But I then stumbled across a secondhand bookshop, and I can't even remember the title of this book, but it was a collection of excerpts from Plato's dialogues. And I found that much easier to read. And so I wonder if today, in the age of the internet, more people might get into Plato if they were able to access it through excerpts, for example,
Yeah. Well,
or
there's a very good Plato reader published by the University of Edinburgh Press. I'm just the name of the editor of the book temporarily escapes me, but it's in the bibliography of my biography of Plato. So. Yeah,
well,
but he just it's a pity, but he has the reputation of being difficult, and some of his later works are
yeah,
difficult. You would not
some of them
recommend
are.
reading the Laws or the Sophist or the Statesman to anybody. They need to work up to that, in exactly the same way I believe as people in Plato's Academy needed to work up to those dialogues. But yeah, the ones you've mentioned, and I'd add the Phaedo as well and the Gorgias. Easy to read, and as I said before, you'll get something out of it. Everybody will get something out of them.
I think also some people may be shocked when they read. Actually, I've heard people say that when they read Plato for the first time, they were kind of surprised at the irony and the
Hmm.
sarcasm
Hmm.
and the kind of. It's not philosophy as people would normally envisage it. And part of that, I think we take for granted if we're a little bit more used to the character of Socrates, but people shouldn't necessarily expect to find clear arguments that they shouldn't necessarily expect to walk away from Plato agreeing with everything that he says. They
Absolutely.
may walk away with
Yeah.
more
Sorry.
questions than answers, I was going to say.
Yeah. No. No. That's and Plato. That's exactly what Plato would have wanted. I mean, most famously, the short early dialogues, like Leaky's Charmides and so on, end negatively. They are a discussion of a topic. So does the first book of Plato's Republic, which discusses the concept of justice, and ends up saying, well, we don't know what justice is. Or in Charmides, we don't know what self discipline is or self knowledge is. Or in Leaky's Courage.
Yeah,
So he's actually encouraging readers to do two things, I think, to start to think for themselves, well, hang on, has the argument gone wrong? If so, where's the argument gone wrong? Can I come up with a better argument? So to start to be philosophers themselves and to
hmm,
start to think, what do I actually think about courage? What do I believe it is? How will that belief make me a courageous person or help me to be a courageous person and so on?
hmm.
So yeah, definitely
Well,
Plato wanted that outcome.
that leads on, I think, to quite naturally to maybe what's quite a deep or quite a serious question, which is, do you think everyone's ready for that? Because even in the time of Plato and Socrates, there were some people who found that exhilarating, and they describe even being kind of addicted to engaging in conversation with Socrates. And there were other people that were utterly repelled and unnerved by this kind of questioning approach. And I assume it's similar today. What's the difference, though? I've always really wondered. What if there are two types of people that read the Socratic dialogues? They either love it or hate it. What's the difference between these two groups of people?
I'm reminded of the old joke, Donald. There are two types of people: those who categorize people as two types,
Yeah.
and those who don't. um, no, I can only repeat. I think what I've been saying. He's not difficult to read. If people could overcome that initial hesitation and plunge in, then I think
There are
they'd
some
enjoy it.
people, Robin. I'm going to stop talking about psychology then, right? There's a psychology. You never imagined that we were going to get into that. There's a psychological
What a surprise!
construct called intolerance of uncertainty that
Uh-huh.
that we measure using questionnaire like psychometric tools, and intolerance of uncertainty is actually correlated with anxiety, right?
Yeah.
So some people are more tolerant of ambiguity and uncertainty. And I don't have some grand theory about this, but it does strike me knowing that when I read Plato, I think people who are intolerant of uncertainty are going to have a hard time, or intolerant of it. Those type of individuals, I think,
Do you
who we
think? Do you
meet in
think so,
clinical
or
practice.
would they be? I mean, when we read a book, even if the book ends with uncertainty, because we're the reader, aren't we slightly removed from what we're reading, and so it doesn't affect us personally, perhaps in the way that you're suggesting? I don't know. I'm not a.
I, th-
You're the
I,
psychologist, not
I
me.
half agree with you. Like
Right.
I think in some cases, yeah. But you mentioned earlier that the whole point of Plato is to transform our lives. So I think if somebody goes to Plato and they're just kind of reading it as literature and they're not thinking about, like changing their philosophy of life as a result of it, it might affect them less deeply. But I
Yeah.
think people who are searching for a purpose in life or some kind of meaning and go looking to philosophy and are left with more questions than answers at the beginning are going to have to be
Yeah.
pretty tolerant of ambiguity or
Yeah.
uncertainty.
Yeah. Yeah.
Otherwise,
No.
they're going to be scared and unnerved. Like just people were freaked out allegedly by Socrates, and some people got
Well,
quite
they found
obviously,
him offensive at any rate.
yeah.
But I don't know. Yeah.
They
I don't
must
know
have
what.
found him unsettling,
Oh,
like
yeah.
to
Well,
be,
he said he was the gadfly of Athens.
yeah.
He said his job was to unsettle people.
Well, that leads us nicely into like one of the most vexed questions. We might as well grab the bull by the horns here
This is
because
going to
we're
be the
talking about.
Socratic problem.
How did you guess? Like we're talking about these two guys. Like, so we have to remember some of our listeners haven't read Plato, they're not going to know much about it. So we've been talking about these two guys, Socrates and Plato, a lot, almost interchangeably at times.
Hmm.
Like, and so we should probably explain why do they go? Why is there this double act, and why they go hand in hand? You mentioned that Socrates was the teacher of Plato, but they're welded together, like throughout history because of the way in which Plato wrote his dialogues. So, how would you sum up the Socratic problem for our listeners who haven't heard
Well,
of it before?
yeah, I actually think the welding, I think that's a good image you've come up with. And I think that is right. I think they are so firmly welded together that you can't distinguish the historical Socrates from what you're reading in Plato and Xenophon.
Some
And this,
people disagree. Some people think you can
oh,
to some extent, right?
many scholars think that the most accurate portrait of Socrates is the one that Plato gives us in a series of short
Yeah,
dialogues, which are almost certainly the first works that he wrote. But
yeah.
I think that's wrong. I mean,
Uh-huh. It's a
why
fool's errand.
why would Plato spend 10 years of his life just writing
Uh-huh.
pen portraits of Socrates? He was an original
Yeah,
philosopher, you know,
yeah,
and so basically we've got three portraits. I'm discounting a mini portrait by Aristophanes in a play
yeah.
called Clouds, which is
Okay.
it's unfortunate that one has to discount it because it's actually the only contemporary portrait of Socrates
Yeah.
that we have. The play was produced in 423. Um,
Everything about this is frustrating.
yeah.
Like, yeah,
So, but what we have, discounting Aristophanes, because he made the Socrates character in his play as a sort of a portmanteau figure carrying bits of the sophists and bits of the early proto-scientists, and maybe a bit of him, but we can't really tell. So after that, we're left with three portraits of Socrates. We've got the one in early Plato, where Socrates questions people, doesn't come up with definite answers or ideas or doctrines. Then we've got the Socrates of Plato's middle dialogues, who is
hmm
exactly the opposite, who keeps
hmm
coming up with
yeah,
ideas, steering the conversation more overtly, and even coming up with ideas that contradict ideas that have been presented in the early dialogues in the first portrait of Socrates. And then the third portrait we've got is that of Xenophon. All three are completely
hmm
different, so they can't all
hmm
be right. So to plump for
but they could all be
uh,
wrong.
that's exactly what I think.
Yeah.
None of them are historical portraits. Both Plato and Xenophon were using the figure Socrates for their own philosophical purposes.
Uh-huh.
So to me, the historical Socrates is lost, and we'll never be able to recover him.
Well, I'm going to play devil's advocate, right?
Okay.
Because I don't have a strong view on this, like, but one counter argument would be among those scholars who I think has traditionally have said, well, you're right. I mean, there's not a lot of common ground between Aristophanes' depiction of Socrates and Plato's. They're almost opposite. It's really hard to make much sense out of what Aristophanes says, but isn't there some commonality between Xenophon and Plato's depiction of Socrates? I mean, the big thing that's not there is the theory of forms in Xenophon, but are there maybe other respects in which, and could we not look for commonalities between Xenophon and Plato to try to reconstruct, to get back to the
Yes,
the real Socrates?
there are some commonalities, but the difficulty is making the inference from that to so here we have a facet of the historical Socrates. I mean, for instance, right, Plato wrote dialogues. He had Socrates interacting with other people and conversing with them, trying to settle ethical, especially problems. Xenophon does that once in one of his memorabilia, as they're called, his memoirs of Socrates. He has Socrates doing exactly the same kind of thing. So perhaps we could say from this, right, this is what the historical Socrates genuinely used to do. But you see, that's not certain. Plato's portrait of Socrates doing, as I believe, Platonic work, communicating the ideas that Plato wanted to communicate, not being a historical portrait of Socrates. Plato's portrait of Socrates in that respect was very powerful, very convincing, and I think Xenophon simply tried his hand at coming up with a similar dialogue. As simple as that.
Right.
It's the phenomenon that scholars called intertextuality,
Yeah.
where one writer leans heavily on another to make some point. I mean, to go back to the Apology, excuse me, one of the most notorious examples of this is that, as people who've read the Apology know, that one of the fundamental stories in it is that a friend of Socrates is called Chaerephon went to the oracle of Apollo at Delphi and
Yeah.
asked, "Is anybody wiser than Socrates?" And the oracle said, "No."
It's a really weird story.
Right. So now I absolutely believe that to be fiction. If
Yeah.
it wasn't fiction, why don't we know more about it?
Yeah.
An Athenian has just been called the wisest person in the world. Wouldn't this be something that was reflected in other works by other Athenian writers or speeches or so on and so forth? But the same story crops up not in absolutely identical terms, but in very similar terms in Xenophon as well. So
Yeah.
there again, you see, I think since we can be 90% at least sure that the oracle story is a fiction, then the fact that Xenophon borrowed it, but knowing that it was a fiction. So this is the way intertextuality works. You see, he borrowed this famous story from Plato to make his own points about
And changes
Socrates.
it. Like he has
Slightly changes it. The
the answer's
virtues,
different.
yeah, slightly the virtues that Plato's Apology assigns to Socrates. I can't remember. There's one missing, or one that Xenophon substitutes for another one. Anyway, yeah, it's just a slightly different list of virtues.
And there's no indication of when this happened, really. Not much indication of when this is supposed to have happened
Well,
either.
this is the other thing that to my mind proves that the story is false. Is that Socrates, as far as we know, and our evidence is pretty good, was only ever famous as the person who went around questioning people,
Right.
right? But in Plato's Apology, Chaerephon's question to the oracle, and the oracle says, "No, Socrates is the wisest person in the world," is precisely what triggers Socrates' mission to go around and questioning people, because he says to himself, "Well, come on, I can't be the wisest person in the world. I'll go around and talk to all these clever people that I know, and they'll prove the oracle wrong," which of course he didn't do, and the oracle was proved to be right, at least in the limited sense. Socrates says that I am wise in the limited sense that at least I know that I don't know, which is nice. Um, so I've slightly lost my thread, but yeah, no. So since in the Apology, that's the story that triggers
Yeah,
Socrates' mission to go around questioning people. But
yeah.
since at the same time he was only ever famous as there was no reason for Chaerephon to go to the oracle and ask is Socrates the cleverest person in the world if Socrates hadn't already been doing that, going around and questioning people.
It's a strange question to put to the oracle as well. Like, and it wasn't. I don't think it was easy. Would he not have had to be several days travel?
There
Presumably,
would have been
there's
several days travel.
ceremonies.
Yeah,
Is
it
it? Would
it
he
would
get?
it would have been
Take
expensive.
expensive
But
to ask this odd
you see,
question?
there were two ways of consulting the oracle.
Yeah.
You either, if you, especially if you were a state or perhaps
Right.
a very, very important person, you paid a lot of money, you did a sacrifice, and you asked your question as a question, and the
Uh-huh.
oracle came up with a reply, which the Pythia, the priestess, burbled a
Mhm.
reply. Um, I don't believe in any fumes coming out of the ground there, so but we'll cover that another time if we want. But anyway, she burbled a reply which was interpreted by the priests. So that was the full-fledged, expensive way of consulting the oracle. But the other way was
Uh-huh.
just with a yes/no answer, which was
Right.
Chaerephon had for Socrates, and that was just a black pebble or a white pebble, whichever came out first, black or white pebble.
Right. Right. So maybe it is plausible that he could have put a question like
Oh,
that.
it's plausible he could have put a question, but I just don't think he did.
You don't believe he did. Is it possible? Is there a way of salvaging this anecdote by saying, um, is it possible that what Socrates means is that he was already doing some kind of philosophy? Maybe he was already doing that. He was doing natural philosophy. Plato suggests
In
earlier.
Phaedo, yeah.
All right. Is it possible he was doing natural philosophy and questioning people about the nature of natural phenomena like the sun and so on? But that after receiving the response from the oracle, he began questioning people about the nature of wisdom and the other virtues.
It's possible.
Would that be a kind of compromise?
It's
Right.
possible. I don't
But
believe
this
it.
is the
It's possible.
all right, but this is what you get into. It's like you're
Oh
trying to
yeah,
solve these riddles of like, is there a
yeah,
way of making this work?
yeah.
It doesn't seem to make sense.
But let's stress again, given what we were talking about earlier, that these are scholarly riddles. This is you and
Yeah,
me talking. This is not something that you need to have sorted
you don't
out
need to.
before you read the books. You know, you can just get into the books.
Yeah, yeah. Um, oh, but then I have another question that this kind of triggers for me, and maybe it's looking at it from a slightly different perspective. So, suppose we say that the Socratic dialogues are a particular literary genre, which are kind of, I don't know how you put it, the sort of thought experiments that just use Socrates as a mouthpiece to explore philosophical views. And they're written as dialogues. And so they have to be giving a bit of kind of historical context and dressing. But that's not necessarily accurate, like or reflective of real events. We could view them as largely pieces of historical fiction. Um,
I do.
yeah, but then that prompts another question at another level for me, which is to what extent. So Plato depicts Socrates as a particular type of character, a very different character from the one that's depicted by Aristophanes, for example. The
Hmm.
the the atmosphere that you get from him, it seems like a different sort of guy. Um, Plato generally, like I think it's fair to say, overall, Plato portrays Socrates in a kind of idealized way, like perhaps as the ideal philosopher in a sense. But to what extent was Plato as a person like the Socrates that he depicts in his dialogues? Given that you've written a biography of Plato, let me put it this way. When I read your biography of Plato, I did something that you might think is a little bit odd. And I kind of closed my eyes for a minute and I thought, does this guy sound like Socrates? Does he sound, and I thought, no, he doesn't. He sounds like his life, his character sound quite different in a number of ways from Socrates. And then it reminded me, I think, of a charge that was made as far back as antiquity against Plato, um, which was the charge of hypocrisy, in a sense that he was not the kind of philosopher in real life that he depicted Socrates being in his dialogues. So I guess the question I have is, to what extent, do you think Plato is a real person, resembled the philosopher that he portrays in his dialogues, using Socrates as a literary device?
Very, very early on, when I started to write this biography, I had to address the problem of how much you could infer, as a general problem, not just about Plato, but how much one could infer about an author's character from what he writes. So, to put this at its most extreme,
Mm-hmm.
was Nabokov, Vladimir Nabokov, the author of Lolita, was he, as a historical person, obsessed with underage girls? No, he wasn't. He was just writing a book. So I actually don't think there's much to be inferred about Plato's character from the character of Socrates in the dialogues. I think that, as we've already said to a certain extent, Socrates is a fiction created by Plato for his own purposes. Can we infer the character of Sophocles from, Oedipus and Antigone and all those other people in his plays? No, we can't. We can't do that with any playwright. We can say certain things about Sophocles. We can say certain things about Shakespeare, that his humanitarianism or whatever. But it's only at a very sort of general level that we can make these inferences. So again, I'm being rather same, as I was with the Socratic problem. I just don't think we can read the historical Socrates off from the dialogues, and I don't think we can read Plato's character off from the Socrates of the dialogues either.
Let me ask you another related question. Actually, I'll ask you a very specific one. Did Plato go around barefoot
Did Plato go around barefoot?
like Socrates?
I
Is
should
reputed
think
to have done.
probably not.
Probably not, right?
Yes.
So this is my example, right?
Right.
So why?
No, but
And
no. Okay, so let me go
yeah,
back. What I should have said when we were talking about the Socratic problem is I should have said I don't think we get any insight into the historical Socrates except for a few personalia,
right,
except
yeah,
for a few personal traits,
that he was
like
known for
yeah,
widely,
like
like
going
his lack of
barefoot. But
footwear.
even that going barefoot stuff is
It's a cliche.
open to doubt, because I mean,
Yeah,
it belongs to that whole biographical tradition about Socrates, which had him being poor.
yeah,
He was not
right.
poor.
No,
As a historical fact, Socrates was not poor. He was a member of the hoplite caste, which was the sort of, let's say, the middle class to upper middle class. No,
can you salvage that though by saying that he was a relatively poor
it was well. I mean,
member of the
he
middle
was he
class?
was poor in the sense that he was uninterested in making money. So whatever wealth he had, he simply got through
Yeah,
because he wasn't working as a stonemason or whatever he was supposed to
yeah.
be working at.
Allegedly worked at his.
Yeah,
So,
but
but then again, but Plato wasn't poor,
no,
right?
Plato was
And
certainly not poor.
and yet, so could we say that Plato is dissimilar to the character of Socrates that he portrays in terms of Socrates' lifestyle? So does it not come across sometimes? I mean, I think even this is debatable, right? So I'm treading very carefully here. Does it not to many people come across as if Plato is presenting an idealized image of a philosopher who lives in relative poverty, goes about barefoot, doesn't commit his thought to writing, and yet Plato was wealthy,
Yeah,
taught in an institution that he set up, didn't teach in the Agora, didn't go about barefoot, um,
but
quoted
I mean,
tyrants.
you're supporting my fundamental point here, which is
Yeah,
that we can't we can't learn about Plato from Socrates.
But then, why did Plato? Would you know? Well, let me put it another way. I suppose you're a student in the academy. You might say, Plato, why do you keep telling us these stories about this philosopher that goes around barefoot, lives in poverty, and doesn't write anything? And you're the complete opposite yourself. Like, are you saying that we should be like Socrates? Are you now? And as in my favor, I'll refer to centuries later Epictetus,
Yeah.
who read Plato's dialogues and said to his students, "You guys should emulate Socrates." But Plato did not emulate the Socrates in terms of his lifestyle and behavior.
No.
But the Stoics would have said,
But
You go around barefoot."
the Socrates that Epictetus is talking about is precisely the
Uh-huh.
Socrates of Plato's and Xenophon's works. Again,
Yeah.
he's not the historical Socrates. He's just what Epictetus thought he knew of Socrates from these works.
So Plato's constructed this literary character
Yeah.
of an idealized philosopher, including his lifestyle, his demeanor, and his behavior. And other people centuries later see that as a role model to be emulated, even though it's a work of fiction.
Mm.
But Plato doesn't emulate Socrates' style of teaching or his lifestyle. Or so is this something that we're meant to emulate? If I was a student of Plato, I'd say, Plato, am I supposed to copy what you're doing or what you're depicting Socrates doing in terms of the ideal
Yeah.
lifestyle of a philosopher?
I think if anybody had noticed this tension in ancient times and had put it to
Yeah,
Plato, he'd have said, no, it doesn't matter. Anybody can do philosophy, rich or
right.
poor, possibly even male and female. That's a more difficult one. Slave and non-slave.
Well, there's
Uh,
another example, right, where women admitted into Plato's school. I know that there's a couple of anecdotes. Isn't there an anecdote about women attending but having to disguise themselves as men?
one of them did, yes. There's two. There's two women we hear of in the academy:
Uh-huh.
Axiotheo and Lastheneia. Lastheneia, I think. And yeah, one of them got in by disguising herself as a man. I mean, this evidence is pretty solid, so I have to believe it. But nevertheless, it's very puzzling because they could not
Mm.
have been full members of the academy, because at
Right.
least some of the work of the academy went on at the nearby gymnasium, the gymnasium in the academy park, and
Where women weren't
gymnasium
allowed.
where women weren't allowed, because as the very word gymnasium means, it was where men
Uh-huh.
and boys exercised naked.
Yeah.
So women weren't allowed, just as women weren't allowed at the Olympic Games for the same reason.
Well, then, if we riddle over that and try and salvage it, would that imply that Plato's house was in the suburb outside of the boundaries where
Yeah,
women's access? But I guess it's possible. But like you say, he seems to have done some teaching in the grounds of the gymnasium,
yeah,
if I
yeah.
understand it.
He was. There was certainly two sites. One in the gymnasium, but also possibly elsewhere in the park, just strolling around.
Yeah.
um, where some teaching went on. But then after Plato built his own house nearby, there was also
Mhm.
some, I don't know whether to call it teaching there, but certainly meetings went on there. You see, the academy, let's get on to this. The
Where was
academy
it?
really consisted of two different types of
Yeah.
residents. Um, there were a lot of people, we know only of a few names, but undoubtedly this was the sort of the core of the annual turnover of students consisted of just young men aged 18 to 19 who
Hmm.
walked out from Athens because philosophy, attending some philosopher or other, it didn't have to be Plato, or the academy, but philosophy was seen as a way of rounding off one's general education. And so
Hmm.
this is the context in which we hear, for instance, of Timotheus or Chabrias or Demosthenes, sorry, I'll speak English, um, attending the academy. They didn't do so in order to become philosophers. They didn't take it very deeply or seriously,
Right.
but they just attended as part of their general education. So that was, as I say, I think that was the kind of like bread and butter of the academy. Not bread and butter in the sense of payment, because there were no fees. But the more important, that's a value judgment. the more important aspect of what went on in the academy was the research. And this is where we get the great names. This is where we
Mm-hmm.
get Speusippus, Plato's nephew and his successor as head of the academy after Plato's death, Aristotle, Eudoxus of Cnidus, Heraclides of Pontus. All the great names were um, teachers in their own right eventually. I mean, Aristotle arrived at the academy when he was only 18 years old, so I don't think he was doing much teaching then, but he
Mm-hmm.
certainly later on was doing some teaching within the academy. But they were researchers, and I think it was chiefly them. I think, or this is my imagination. I imagine them, as it were, huddled together with Plato in his house,
Yeah. Right.
discussing these types of much more advanced theories. The
Yeah.
mathematical sciences featured very largely
Yeah.
in their research. Astronomy, especially from Eudoxus of Cnidus. Um, so I think that was I imagined that it wasn't so much teaching that went on in Plato's house as discussion, and I
Mm-hmm.
think I think they would also have gone through the dialogues
Yeah.
as discussion documents.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the early dialogues, as we've already said, ending conclusively. What a great starting point for
Yeah.
discussion.
Yeah.
And a lot of the other later theories are up for grabs. Some of the dialogues, like Philebus, contains a number of theories about pleasure, and it's almost like it's a repository of various views about pleasure that particularly the academic scholars were coming up with.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote down the dialogue perhaps as a discussion document, or most notoriously the dialogue Parmenides. This is a dialogue which, in the first half, subjects the theory of forms to what appear to be really quite devastating
Yeah.
counter arguments. Again, I think that was a discussion document. I think there are good reasons
That would make
for
sense.
not seeing the Parmenides as negative, as obliterating the theory of forms, but as a discussion document for academic scholars to work through.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, just to come back to my earlier point, actually, because I think you've just mentioned something that's another example of it. Perhaps the character of Socrates doesn't come across as someone comes across as someone who's much more interested in questioning the nature of virtue and ethical questions in daily life, something that he was reputedly known for. Whereas the teaching in Plato's Academy must have focused on those questions, but it also seems to have placed a lot of emphasis on mathematical research, which doesn't really come across as it's difficult to imagine Socrates saying what you guys need to do is spend 10 years studying mathematics and geometry or whatever. And
There's even one of Xenophon's Memorabilia, you'll remember, Donald, where
he
he
says
has
the
Plato
opposite.
specifically
Yeah.
saying, this is of limited use.
Yeah.
Doing the science, understanding cosmology and things is of really limited use in your life. So yeah,
Isn't
that's
there an anecdote about Socrates saying you only need to know enough geometry to measure a plot of land or something like that? Which
rings a
it
bell.
sounds
Yeah, it sounds perfectly plausible. Yes,
so
yes, I'm sure.
studying these theoretical subjects is of value, but only insofar as it's useful in solving
Yeah,
problems in daily
I
life.
think I think I mean it's I don't like to periodize things too much, to separate one set of
Uh-huh.
dialogues off from another, but you could conceivably see the early dialogues as it were, clearing the ground
Right.
for the
Okay.
later dialogues to build on, something like that.
I had another question that came up earlier that's kind of bugged me for a while, and maybe this is just my lack of knowledge about the history. But we mentioned that women weren't allowed into the gymnasia.
Yeah,
Um, were non-Athenians allowed into? So the Kunasarges, I understand, was the gymnasium that was accessible to people who were only half Athenian.
yeah.
Or so my understanding previously was that it was only Athenian citizens, full Athenian citizens, that were permitted into the Lyceum and the Academy. But Plato's students are not all Athenian.
No, quite very few of
The
them are
foreign.
really, apart from the. But this is why I think that it was the sort of the teaching of the juniors that went on in the academy, went on in
Right.
the gymnasium, whereas the
So
more
they would have been
senior
Athenian
stuff,
citizens.
they would largely, at any rate, have been Athenian citizens. Your question, I don't know the answer to. I don't know whether non-Athenians were allowed in the academy. I would have thought they were. I mean, you've got this whole class of residents, not citizen of Athens, who were called metics, metoikoi, who were non-Athenian residents of Athens and very often long-term residents of Athens. And we meet a number of
Yeah.
them in Plato's dialogues, like Polemarchus in the first book of the Republic, and Lysias the orator was another one.
In
Um,
Piraeus, though.
yes, there's not that. Yeah, Piraeus was more of a home for these people, but they were in
Yeah.
Athens as well.
Yeah.
Um, Piraeus was more of a home for them because they were often very involved in business matters, and Piraeus was the business
Trade.
center.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, so, yeah. No, I don't think I've got anything more to say about that.
Well, I guess we're painting a picture of what life was like in the academy, and maybe you can just elaborate a bit on that. That if I ask you more directly, what do you think it was like being a student at Plato's academy? And we haven't. I think we only touched very lightly on the curriculum, for example. You know, if you went to become a student of Plato at the academy, what would you think the experience would be like?
Um, well, I don't know, and I don't think we can answer that because we actually don't know. We have plenty of evidence about the research that was going on among the
Right.
senior students, but we have no evidence whatsoever of what kind of teaching was going on in the gymnasium. I say it was philosophy as the culmination of a person's higher education, but we don't know. Did they work through dialogues? Possibly.
Well,
Um, were they, or were they simply, did they work through the history of philosophy to a certain extent? I mean, Plato shows quite a bit of interest in his predecessors. Um, so all of these things might have come up, but I don't know, and
I th-
I don't think there's any way that we ever will know precisely
I
what
think you're
type.
giving a partial answer, actually, which is that maybe, given that we think of the academy as the home of specifically of philosophy, I think what you've implied is that the studies that they undertook there were broader in scope than we would normally do in a philosophy department today. Say,
That's
we
absolutely
mentioned
right.
mathematics and
Yeah.
studying literature.
Yeah.
Would they have studied rhetoric
Oh
in the
yeah,
academy too?
yeah.
Yeah,
In fact, it's said with what genuineness I don't know that Aristotle taught rhetoric in the academy.
yeah.
Um, now hang
So
on, what did you just said something that triggered something?
they were polymaths by modern standards.
Yeah, most certainly. I mean, the senior researchers were.
Yeah.
Um,
So it wasn't just a philosophy department. It was kind
no,
of it was
yes,
broader in
that's what I
scope.
was going to say. I mean, but the history of the term philosophy is quite interesting, and it wasn't really until early in the 19th century that it became separated off as
Yeah.
a separate subject, more to be studied in universities than anywhere else. But up until then, it included, if you did astronomy, like my great 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 grandfather William and Herschel did, and his son John, that was part of philosophy. You know.
So
Um,
that prompts another question for me, Robin, which is the again we might think, well, they're all studying Plato's theory of forms and stuff like that. But from what you've said in your biography, the early academy was fairly undogmatic in that there's some evidence of different views
yeah,
regarding philosophy.
this is one of the most interesting things about the academy. Um, we know from reading Aristotle's works,
Mm-hmm.
and we know from what we know of the ideas of others of Plato's closest associates, people like Speusippus and Xenocrates,
Mm-hmm.
we know that they came up with theories that contradicted
Yeah.
Plato's. So whatever else the academy was, and that's one of the reasons I say it's probably best to describe it as a kind of a research center, fostering research. But whatever
Yes,
else it was not a school for the perpetuation of Plato's ideas.
for churning out copies of Plato, as it were.
Scholars were, yeah, no, not
That
at
gives
all.
me
No clones, no
that
clones.
no clones, right? But that then leads to another question, right? Why? Why did Aristotle leave to found his own school then? Because it sounds like that it was fairly tolerant of disagreement. Like, how tall were there limits to that? Did Aristotle leave and found his school for other reasons? Could his divergence from Plato's views have been tolerated within the academy
Well, I think
itself?
yes, I think they were. I mean, I think Aristotle was probably writing stuff writing works in which he disagreed with Plato, even while he was still in the working in the academy. Um, he left the academy immediately after Plato's death, and it's possible he left in a bit of a huff at not being chosen
And
to
not
be
being, yeah,
Plato's successor,
being passed over.
being passed over. But he was still a young man. Speusippus was elderly. Speusippus was much more plugged into the academy than Aristotle was, because Speusippus was much more of a mathematician than Aristotle ever was.
So are we
So
wrong then
he might have
to,
left in
to
a bit of a huff, but
under a cloud?
I'm not sure about it, but it's possible. But more importantly, I think he started his own school
Yeah,
for exactly the same reason that Plato and Antisthenes and others, Phaedo of Elis, started their own schools after Socrates' death. I think Socrates would heartily have improved. Go away. Go and do, you're grown ups now. Go and do your own stuff, develop your own philosophy in your own way. And I think Plato would have been absolutely delighted to see Aristotle and others going ahead and doing that.
and Zeno also
Yeah, not
studied at
that
the
he knew
academy.
Plato, of course. He studied with
No,
Xenocrates. Yeah,
and
but no,
Polemon.
but I think Xeno's a slightly different case, Donald.
Uh-huh,
You know more about his life than I do, so tell me if you think I'm barking up the wrong tree. But from what we seem to know about Zeno's time in Athens,
uh-huh.
before he started his school, he dotted around. He
Yeah,
attended the lectures of Crates, of Xenocrates, of some others who I can't remember off the top of my head. So that smacks to me, that suggests to me that right from the start he was thinking of starting his own school.
and the Megarians. He studied under. You could read it as being
Stilpo was another one, wasn't it? Yeah,
Stilpo.
yeah.
Like he may have been studying in different Socratic schools. I mean, it's possible he was. Maybe he was even trying to reconstruct like what Socrates had taught, all these different schools that descended from him. But there's, I don't think there's any mention of him studying in the Lyceum, from
No,
what I
I don't think
recall,
so either. Yeah, yeah.
which is
So
interesting.
as you say, picking from all the different Socratic
Yeah,
trees. Yeah,
perhaps.
perhaps.
Um, but he was also very interested in Pythagoreanism. He wrote a book about the Pythagoreans, which is a somewhat more artless segue into asking you about Plato and the Pythagoreans. But I think a lot of people wouldn't realize this, perhaps, or it takes them a while to kind of think about it from this perspective. Plato was really into. We've talked about how he's a huge fan of Socrates, and this is his idol, and so on. But Plato was also into Pythagoreanism. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about what his relationship with Pythagoreanism was and to what extent
Yeah,
you feel that influenced his philosophy.
I think he owed the Pythagoreans a very great deal. I think that one way you could characterize at least some of the major differences between the dialogues written earlier in Plato's life and the middle period dialogues is precisely that they were influenced by Pythagoreanism, because in
Mhm.
between, Plato went on the first of his famous journeys. He went to southern Italy and to Sicily, and specifically, I'm sure, to meet the Pythagoreans, because the Pythagoreans
Yeah.
had long been and were still based in southern Italy. So, for instance, he met Archytas of Tarentum and others in Locri and Tarentum and in Syracuse. And then he came back and carried on writing. And I think, as I say, I think there are multiple influences. For instance, let's go back to the theory of forms.
Mm.
The theory of forms, in brief, what is it that enables us to identify things, to name their qualities? There are no perfect models of beauty here on earth for us to look to say, oh, yeah, look, that gets quite close to beauty. So, how come we have a notion of ideal beauty to which things here on earth more or less approximate? Plato thought that what enables us to identify things, identify the properties of things, are these immaterial entities he calls forms, which is how we translate the Greek word eider. But how did we get to know these immaterial entities? That was a puzzle for Plato until he came across the Pythagorean notion of metempsychosis, that souls are
Okay.
serially incarnated in bodies.
Right.
So, right, said Plato, if our souls are immortal, then at some time in the past we must have acquired knowledge of forms, or at least a glimpse of them, as he puts it in Phaedrus. And so he
Hmm.
concluded, when we work with forms in our lifetimes, that is, for instance, when we call something beautiful or call an action courageous or something like that, what we're doing is remembering what we came to know sometime in the past. So this combination of the idea of forms, which he gained from reflecting on the work of the early dialogues, combined with Pythagorean metempsychosis, gives us Plato's theory of recollection, as it's called, that our knowledge of forms isn't getting to know them, it's remembering them
Hmm.
from the past. So that's one example, a very important one, of Plato's debts to the Pythagoreans. Another one I could mention would be that the Pythagoreans famously said there were three basic types of people,
Yeah.
and that everyone has elements of all three types in them, usually with one dominant, either dominant over one's whole life or dominant at any given moment. And they used a metaphor of the kinds of people who attend the Olympic Games. They said some people come to make money, they're trading, hawking goods, etc., etc. Some come to compete, that's the athletes, and some just to watch. So
Hmm.
some people desire gain, that's their fundamental motivation. Some people desire honor, they're the prickly, egoistic types,
Hmm.
and some just desire to observe. And now Plato took that over lock, stock, and barrel for his famous theory that every human soul has
Yeah.
three parts: an appetitive part, an honor
Hmm.
loving part, and a rational part. So
Hmm.
again, that's I think a direct influence from the Pythagoreans to Plato, and again, that's a view that we don't get in the early dialogues, and then we suddenly get in the middle
Yeah.
dialogues, particularly Republic, Meno first, then Republic and Phaedrus. So in general, I think I'd say that what the Pythagoreans gave Plato was the occasional kind of mystical tinge to his work,
Yeah.
perhaps especially in Phaedrus. Again, going back to why not read Plato? Phaedrus is wonderful. It consists that a large chunk of the book is this fabulous myth about the human soul. Um, anyway, I won't say more. Spoiler alert. But Phaedrus is just it's a wonderful, wonderful piece of literature, and everybody should read it.
Yeah.
But the Pythagoreans
Uh,
were also the foremost mathematicians of their time. We've
right.
already said how
Right.
Plato rated mathematics and mathematical sciences very highly, so that's another part of it.
But to what extent would Socrates have been exposed to Pythagoreanism? Um, I mean, just when you're saying this, I guess this is a trivial comment to make, but Plato puts some of these thoughts into the mouth of Socrates. And you could say he's over time he's using Socrates, this historical figure, as a vehicle for expressing Pythagorean influenced ideas, which is a little
Mm-hmm.
bit odd in a way. The one thing that Socrates doesn't say in the Apology is that he's not worried about being executed because he believes in reincarnation
No, exactly.
and
And in
metempsychosis.
fact, he's very skeptical about what happens after death
Yeah.
in the Apology, and that's a direct contrast with Plato's views on reincarnation in the Middle Dialogues.
But Socrates presumably would have known Pythagoreans. Um,
It's difficult to say quite what. I mean, you'll remember that famously Plato's only direct mention of Pythagoras occurs in the Republic, and he
Right.
describes him as the founder of a way of life,
Yeah.
not as a philosopher. Now,
Right.
so I think historically that's how Pythagoras would have been regarded in Socrates' day. It was really only when a chap called Philolaus came along, a
Right.
Pythagorean called Philolaus came along in the later 5th century,
Uh-huh.
I think contemporary with Socrates, overlapping with Socrates' lifetime. It was only then that Pythagoreanism gained, as it were, more doctrine. Philolaus was, if you like, the St. Paul to
Hmm.
Pythagoras' Jesus.
Hmm. Well, do you think there's a connection between Pythagoreanism and the mystery religions in the sense that, maybe it was a kind of quasi-religious
Yes, I
doctrine
think there
or
was a
self?
connection. I think there was a connection in what they were trying to, what initiates were trying to gain. I don't think there was any similarity of method, background. Pythagoreanism wasn't necessarily religious in the same sense that the mysteries were centrally part of Greek religion, but both the mysteries and Pythagoreanism were offering people the chance of a better afterlife.
There's a
Or in the
connection.
case of the Pythagoreans, not just a better afterlife, but the ability to remain conscious in the underworld and choose your next incarnation rather than having it stuffed upon you by somebody else.
I think you mentioned in your book the connection between Plato and Apollo, and
Yeah,
there are a number of sources. I think Diogenes Laertius is one of them that uh, claim that Pythagoras derived his ethical teachings from Pythia, um, and there are a number of associations between the worship of Apollo, if I remember rightly, and the Pythagorean sect. So I do wonder if there's some connection between the cult of Apollo at Delphi and Pythagoreanism.
not that I know of. I mean, Apollo, like all the Greek gods, was very capacious.
Yeah,
I mean,
very
for
much.
instance, taking Apollo, his capacity was such that he was simultaneously the god of healing and the god of causing disease. Um, and quite often the Greek gods get, as it were, extra names attached to them. We've got Zeus the Thunderer as one aspect of Zeus. We've got Zeus the Kindly as another aspect of Zeus, and so on and so forth. We've even in Olympia, where the Olympic Games was held, we've even got Zeus the Averter of Flies.
Yeah,
Right. So
it's useful in parts of Greece.
yeah, for sure, particularly around there.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've talked, but now we're getting into we're talking a bit about mythology and the pre-Socratics, into the dark, more mysterious parts of Greek history. But I thought to conclude, maybe we could bring things bang up to date. And I just wondered if you have any thoughts. We talked at the very beginning about why people should care about Plato. And I wonder, whenever I talk to people today about philosophy, they want to know things like how philosophy could help them in their lives to develop emotional resilience, to cope with stress. But one of the main things that people mention, one of the challenges that people perceive is dealing with social media, misinformation. People feel quite manipulated by
Yeah.
influencers, and well, let me actually make a statement. I used to think the sophists were all dead and gone. And
Hmm.
then I started to think one day, the relationship that we have with social media in general is not dissimilar in some ways to the relationship that the ancient Athenians had with the sophists. Social media's algorithms are designed to use a kind of rhetoric, like in their own way. They're all about manipulating us, evoking our emotions,
Yeah.
captivating our interest. They're experts at persuasion in a different but not completely unrelated way. And so the challenge that we face is similar. How do we avoid having our strings pulled
Yeah, I
by
think that's a really good insight, Donald. I like that comparison between influencers and the sophists. Yeah. I don't know whether you follow the Doonesbury cartoon, but last Sunday's was pretty good. The parents are saying, "Why don't you go and get a job?" They're saying to their daughter, and she says, "What do you mean? I've been an influencer for 2 years, and now I'm a creative."
yeah, like it's
Anyway,
quite strange.
what I think Plato would, I think I think Plato would have a pretty clear line of approach, which is, and he would start by reminding us that our actions should be based on knowledge, not belief. And this
Yeah.
distinction between knowledge and belief is absolutely central to Plato's philosophy. He
Hmm.
develops it several times: Republic, Theaetetus, Meno,
Hmm.
very important. So, whether we're dealing with, it doesn't matter whether it's misinformation or true information, we should
Hmm.
not take anyone else's word for it, even if it's true
Hmm.
information, but come to our own understanding and base our worldview on knowledge, not on belief. Um, Beliefs are commonly based, as you were saying, on persuasive agents like advertising, an influencer you think trustworthy, society's norms as a whole. That's one
Hmm.
of the, as Plato points out in Republic, that's one of the largest areas of influence on young people, especially.
Hmm.
But these agents can only ever make us believe something. What a
Hmm.
philosopher should do, or the way a philosopher might, or the way Plato would have approached this kind of issue, would be to say that you have to work to turn your belief into knowledge. And that's largely
Hmm.
internal work. That's not something you get from an influencer. He says in Meno that you have to not just believe that something is the case, which may indeed be true, it may be a true belief, but you have to work out why it's the case. And that's the way you convert belief into knowledge. Um,
It gets.
and although in later dialogues he professes himself much more puzzled about what knowledge is, that's a pretty good approach to knowledge, to say it's working out why a belief is true. I think a lot of modern philosophers would agree with that. Even
I feel like there's
um,
some kind of connection as well between one of the phenomena that I notice now is that everybody's an expert on things that they weren't experts on before. So during the pandemic, everybody was an expert on epidemiology. Suddenly, all the doctors were wrong, and the influencers, suddenly became experts on stuff that they clearly had no methodological understanding whatsoever of how to evaluate research studies. And nevertheless, they're quoting them left, right, and centre.
yeah,
And one of the main things that Plato's Socrates warns us against is this idea of double ignorance, or he calls it conceit, that
yeah,
consists in believing that you know things that you do not know.
yeah.
And Socrates says that ignorance isn't particularly dangerous in itself as long as you know that you don't know something.
But it's that
But if
conceit of
you,
knowledge that's dangerous. Yes.
yeah, and that I feel like the internet is full of people who believe that they know things that they don't know,
Yeah.
and
I
it
don't
means
think
that
that.
they're.
Yeah, I don't think there's any particular danger in this, as long as you're a little bit, as long as your attitude is that you're kind of playing a game, so that you're a little
Uh-huh.
bit removed from. I mean, like, if you see a movie, it's entertainment. You don't necessarily have to believe everything.
Mhm.
So I think if one could adopt that kind of uh, hands off, or uh, slightly detached view of influences, then it wouldn't matter,
Right.
or of your own beliefs. Then I don't think they would be particularly harmful. What's harmful is acting on them and being absolutely convinced that you're right.
Yeah, a kind of closed mindedness that
Yes.
comes from conceitedly believing that you know something. And also, I wonder if there's some connection between what we get over social media and from influencers isn't knowledge; it's sound bites, basically, right? Like you were
Yeah.
saying, it's stuff that you could rote learn or memorize or just kind of regurgitate um, without understanding
Yeah.
how
Well,
it
I
would be.
think so. I don't follow any influencers, so I don't know.
Social media. It's
Are you an
similar in
Are
a
you
way.
an influencer, Donald?
No, you are. You, maybe we all are. I think we all are now. I sometimes wonder, but it kind of reminds me of some of the things that Plato says about, has Socrates say about books. sometimes he looks somewhat askance at books because Socrates is frustrated that you can't ask books questions.
Yeah.
Like they don't speak back to you. And in the same way, what you get from the sophists, as I understand it, although they did sometimes engage in dialectic and do other things, but they were mainly known for delivering speeches. And people, it seems like, I believe that the ancient Athenians, like the youths who went and listened to sophists, would often, it sounds like, just parrot what they'd heard the sophists saying. I think that's part of what concerns Plato, is you'd go and you'd hear an amazing speech about justice from Protagoras or whatever, and
Yeah.
then it might even be correct. It might
Yeah.
even contain some wisdom, but there's no dialectic. Like you just then go away and kind of parrot or regurgitate the best bits of the speech.
Yeah.
And I think that's what people get from social media. It's a kind of passive experience of acquiring knowledge, like you say, that leads to
Yeah.
belief or
I think I'd
opinion
agree
rather
with
than
that. Yeah.
genuine knowledge or understanding.
At the beginning of Phaedrus, Plato has Phaedrus doing exactly what you just said, parroting an entire speech of
Yeah,
Lysias. Um, and then Plato has Socrates then deliver two other speeches which sort of contradict, well, first contradicts what Lysias was saying and then contradict himself
yeah,
as well. Read
yeah.
the Phaedrus, people.
Secondhand knowledge that people are kind of recycling. Read the Phaedrus, read all of
Read them all.
Plato. I even like this. One of my favorite dialogues is the Axiochus, which is a pseudo-Platonic dialogue,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it is
but
quite fun. Actually, I haven't looked at it
it's
for
pretty good.
years. I haven't looked at it for years. I must do so again. It's nice and short as well. So
It's a consolation dialogue, which I kind of like because it's therapy. Like he's doing a sort of psychological therapy, and it's arguably part of the consolation literature. It's about a guy.
that's right. Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
I think
I,
he's the uncle of Alcibiades, and he's dying. And so, what do you want when you're on your deathbed, about to pass away? Is for Socrates to come round and ask you lots of questions. Really, it makes him feel sort of makes him feel better, but worse at the same time.
yeah. Let's go away. It's
But
too late.
yeah. So anyway, we've had a great discussion, and I hope that some people, just like Robin has said, the Apology in particular is a masterpiece, and I'm hesitant to recommend books to people because I think people read books for different reasons. But I make an exception actually for the Apology, and you might for the Republic. But I think the first book of the Republic, or the Apology, you could read in a few hours. Like so, you at
Less than a
best,
few hours.
yeah, you'll have consumed a masterpiece of Western philosophical literature. At worst, it'll have cost you, yeah, less than a few hours.
Yeah.
So for that reason, I say definitely, give it a go. People should go out and read it, and they should also read. And then once they've read that, they should go out and get themselves a copy of Plato of Athens, like Robin's most recent book. Many other books that you can go. Is it true that you wrote fighting fantasy
Yep.
books? It says that on your Wikipedia page. I
I
didn't
was.
know that.
I was. I not only wrote one, two, three, four or five of them. I was the sort of series editor for a while.
Oh yeah. Did you write science fiction ones or kind of
Yes,
sword and
the first,
sorcery?
yeah, the then commissioning editor for the series, when she said, "Robin, why don't you write one of these?" Specifically said, I want a science fiction one." She wanted to see
Mm.
if the science fiction genre worked as well as the fantasy genre, and I don't think it does. I think the science fiction ones proved less popular, at any rate, with the kids, with the readers. But having said that, my science fiction one, Rebel Planet, is all the other ones I wrote were fantasy, swords and sorcery fantasy ones. But my science fiction one, Rebel Planet, is currently being turned into a graphic novel.
Awesome. Cool. Cool. Well, I mentioned to you earlier that we'd like to end on a question, I guess in a kind of Socratic vein, to leave everybody with a burning question that they can reflect on. So what would you like to ask our listeners?
I feel embarrassed doing this, Donald, but I think there's only one. I think there's only one really, really big question, and here I'm going to quote a made-up science fiction writer called Kilgore Trout. We can go into Kilgore Trout's history later if you like. And he wrote a book called Venus on the Half Shell, which is a quest book in which the protagonist, the hero, travels through the universe to try to find God with one question. Why are we born to suffer and die? And that, I think, is the only question that there is for human beings. And it's a two-part question, because it's not just, first of all, it's why is it the common lot of humankind to be born and suffer and die? But then you can personalize it. Why am I born to suffer and die? Or in other words, what am I here for? What's my role in life? If you believe in God or fate or destiny in some way, what have I been put here on earth to do? So I think this is a good question.
And they may find some clues in Plato,
They may find some clues in
perhaps,
Plato.
if
Yeah.
they're lucky. Well, thanks once again, Robin, for joining us today. It's been a fascinating discussion, and thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. And please go out, take a look at Robin's books, take a look at Plato, and have a think about the question that he's left us with, and maybe post your comments online on the old social media, and maybe put it to some more constructive use. So bye, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
I
Thanks
thank you,
again, Robin.
Donald. Thank you very
Cheers.
much.